Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Sarah Montague. In a matter of weeks, Britain will leave the EU. And yet, what happens then is still not agreed. The sticking point in negotiations is the Irish border. How can the UK be outside the European Union and yet there be no change to the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic? But the Good Friday Agreement 20 years ago brought peace to Ireland in large part because it made the border invisible. My guest today, Bertie Ahern, was Irish Prime Minister at the time of the Good Friday Agreement and was one of its signatories. Does he really think peace is threatened now? Bertie Ahern, welcome to Hard Talk. How great do you think is the threat to peace from Brexit?
Well, I've continually said over the last 2 years that I hope that there's never any return to violence again and that we never go back to the bad old days. But I think we have to be aware that the idea of an infrastructural border again, going back to customs posts, going back to police or army on the border would really heighten fears and tensions. The border has been controversial for, since the 1920s. The IRA campaign of 1956 to 62 was just a border campaign. It was centred around the border. And of course the more recent troubles, well, recent in terms that it was 1968-69 on to the 1998 agreement, that was a large part on the border too. And we know that there is, grave tensions at the moment along the border. So I still want to believe that we had no return to violence, but I think the tensions, the animosity, the enmity, the bitterness, the hatred, that bringing back any kind of an infrastructure border it cannot be ignored.
But neither side, no one in these negotiations wants there to be any police or army, as you're talking about, on the border. And most people are saying they don't really want customs checks either, at least not on the border itself.
Well, I agree with that, Sarah. And the difficulty is, and it's a pity that 587 pages of the withdrawal agreement is coming down to talking about one issue. I don't for a moment think that it's the only issue, but people are saying that the backstop is really the only issue, and that's what the vote recently in Westminster was indicating as well. The backstop is merely a safety net that to avoid in the event of there being no trade deal between the EU and the UK, that there can't be a hard border. And I suppose also that there can be no tariffs, there can be no customs, that there can be no rules of origins or no custom procedures that could create a hard border or create terms between the EU and the UK that would create difficulties on the border.
But can I ask you though, before we'll get into the sort of the various details of what's going on and the options, but how is it that you could see, let's assume there aren't police or army on the border, how then could violence re-emerge? What are the provocative things, or the things that could be seen as provocative, that would allow it to happen?
I think the old way was that there were customs checks before it really got violent, and continually any kind of physical infrastructure on the border was always a source of attack. It was always a source of identifying a division on the island of Ireland. And of course, then we had, later on, we had the huge watchtowers, the security watchtowers that were seen as essential by the British Army. Then you had the police barracks, and all of these things were removed. Part of the agreement that I did with Tony Blair was it wasn't actually part of the Good Friday Agreement, but in the subsequent discussions that went on from 1998 to 2007, they're all removed. So now when you hit the border, there is nothing. It is an invisible line. People know where it is, the local people know where it is, but there is nothing to indicate that we can't drive from Dublin to Belfast, that we can drive to Derry, that we can drive all over the place, and there is no infrastructure. Pascal Lamy, who is the expert, I suppose, on trade issues, headed the WTO once, European Commissioner on Trade, he indicates that it is impossible in the event of the UK and the EU deal that you have to have a physical border if there's no agreement on the withdrawal terms. And I think he's a person who, you know, is eminently placed to be able to indicate something.
There are others, though, who say there are other ways of doing the checks, and we know that both the British government and the Irish government have said they do not want to put back any form of physical checks. Are you suggesting that even if there were a camera on a road, by a road, that could see a re-emergence of violence?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, rather than think of violence as we did in the past, Sarah, I think you could take it that if there was any kind of physical customs checks put along the border, that you wouldn't have to be waiting for paramilitary groups to remove them. The local people in the border area just wouldn't allow it. And you know where that leads to, and then security people are dragged into it. I mean, the view of people in the island of Ireland, and most people, I think everybody in the island of Ireland, I think of all traditions, they do not want to see any kind of a physical infrastructure imposed. And this is the difficulty. Nobody wants it. The EU don't want it. The British government don't want it. The Irish government don't want it. I think none of the political parties want it. But the very essence of having a trade agreement where you have to have checks and balances, where you have to look at the rules of origins, where you have to look at customs procedures, where you have to have tariffs, then you're almost forced to put the border somewhere.
Indeed.
And,
so,
you know,
then you're left with the question of how can the UK ever leave the EU?
Well, you know, I honestly believe, and I hope that in the days to come, that there can be an agreement found around some of these issues. I don't honestly believe that it's not possible to find an understanding in negotiations. I spent 20 years of my life involved in all kinds of negotiations, from budget arrangements to EU treaty changes to the enlargement process that I did during the Irish presidency. You know, really enormous issues, and it really is not clear to me why we can't try and find a solution to this. It has beaten everyone to date, but I still think it's necessary.
And that's partly because of the point you were just making, that any form of trade agreement would necessitate increased checks, and that, as you suggest, is a problem. Now, any checks are going to be needed. The free trade agreement, it perhaps suggests why there is such a problem with the backstop, because nobody could see how you could ever leave it, how you could ever leave a customs union between the UK and the EU.
Yeah, well, I mean, I very much understand the British government's point that if you have an arrangement at the backstop, that you can never get out of it. But the way out of it is that in the future relationship, that an alternative is found. And I think that's the challenge. I mean, I think for people who are looking at this day in, day out, and I know that in Brussels and in London and Dublin they're doing this, that, you know, there must be a way in the future relationship. And because we all remember, there will be no backstop necessary if there's a trade deal, a satisfactory trade deal worked out between the EU and the UK. My honest belief is that because the trade is so important to both EU countries and to the UK, that in the future relationship they will work out a trade deal. I mean, it is really nonsensical to believe that over the next few years, I know these things can drag on, I accept that point, but that it must be possible for the interests of both the European Union and the UK in the future relationship to find a better relationship.
Okay, but so can I just establish, Can you see a way that the UK can leave a customs union with the EU?
Well, I mean, my personal point of view, I would rather see the UK stay in the customs union.
Yes, I'm just wondering if it's possible, because free trade agreements rely on some form of checks.
They do, but if there's a no deal, look, there's two parts in this. If they leave with a no deal, you straight away apply to WTO rules. And I go back to what Pascal Lamy said on this, and I think everybody else has too, that if WTO rules are applied, then you have to have a hard border. And that seems clear, and I don't think people are disagreeing with that. I've sat through many sessions on Brexit in universities and elsewhere with various experts, and it seems clear that if you go to WTO rules, that you have a hard border. Then leave that one aside. If there is an EU UK trade deal, then it is imperative that you have to find a different relationship than the backstop. And that is the challenge. But I find that, listen, I've seen compromises in all kind of things, including the compromises in the Good Friday Agreement. And I know the withdrawal agreement has already compromises, but it does not seem beyond the width of men and women to be able to find a solution in the future relationship that will prevent the backstop staying forever.
It's one of the reasons that the DUP leader, Arlene Foster, the former Northern Ireland First Minister, said through the intransigence of the European Union and the Republic of Ireland in their attitude, they're actually more likely to bring about the very thing that they want to avoid, i.e. they're not compromising and therefore a no deal is more likely. Do you agree with her?
Well, you know, the clock is running down and we're rolling down the hill. You know, there's only 6-7 weeks now to the end of March. I still think that there is, I may be wrong in this, but I still think there's a large majority of people in the House of Commons that do not want a no deal. The various options to look at then, do they push the Article 50 out further, and is there a coalition of people from both Labour and from the Tories? But I certainly, let me be very clear on Arlene Foster's point, and I get on well with Arlene Foster, as I do with most unionists and loyalists. There is nobody that I know in the Republic of Ireland, or Northern Ireland for that matter, that wants a no-deal Brexit. It is not in our interest, it's not in anybody's interest, it's not in the UK's interest, but it would cause immense economic difficulties and problems in the island of Ireland. So we do not want a no-deal. We want to try and find a fair compromise. The withdrawal agreement, remember, was negotiated over a 20-month period.
Can I ask you, should the Irish government avoid a no deal at all costs?
Yes, I think they should. I think and I'm sure that the meeting that's coming up between the Taoiseach and the British Prime Minister will be looking at that. It is to try and find a compromise is far better than a no-deal Brexit. But unfortunately, that compromise can't be unravelling the withdrawal agreement, because that is already full of compromises. So, you know, it's not normally in negotiations you're coming to the end line and you're saying, well, let's find a compromise. In this case, the end line was reached last November. The withdrawal agreement, with all its compromises, was concluded. And what the British government are asking now, that it be...
But the reason the British government are asking is because Parliament has voted, a majority of the British Parliament have voted to replace the backstop in the withdrawal agreement. So she has no choice.
I accept that, and I accept that the situation changed on that vote. But therefore you have to look at some arrangements that doesn't undo the withdrawal agreement. I mean, both the parties to the to the withdrawal agreement are the UK and the EU. EU say they're not going to open it up again. The UK are saying they need some alternative arrangements. Therefore, you have to remember a year ago, Sarah, people said you can't put anything about the future relationships into the withdrawal agreement. Now there's a political declaration in the withdrawal agreement, so things can alter and change.
Is the simple solution to add a time limit to the backstop?
No, I think the time limit is not, the way to go. I think if you put a time limit into it, then you're saying that on some future date, let's say the end of 21 or 22, that you're going to have a border. So that is only kicking the can down the road, to use that terrible phrase, and that's the wrong thing to do.
Well, you know about negotiations, you know about the importance of deadlines. And the former Brexit Secretary, David Davis, has made the point there's no case whatsoever for an Article 50 extension, which is what you've just suggested should possibly happen. He says the EU has a history of making deals at the 11th hour. And that is exactly what happened with the Good Friday Agreement. Is Prime Minister Theresa May making the right point when she's not considering any other option because she wants to concentrate minds to get something done in the next few weeks?
I think she is, because 587 pages of a 20-month negotiation is an enormous amount of work, and there's a lot of good things in the withdrawal agreement. There are a lot of positive things in it, and I think to move down to suspend an Article 50 to the end of the year only drags it out. Having a general election is not a possibility. Having another vote doesn't seem a possibility. So I think the focusing on the minds over this period is to look at what can be done, not changing the withdrawal agreement, but maybe in the future relationship, something that is legally binding, which is what I think the House of Commons are saying, and to see if there's a way of doing that. But I'd like to make one very important...
So just to be clear, so no extension, you would say no extension to or delay to Brexit?
Well, I think
not yet, anyway.
I think the delay might be necessary because it's not possible to get all the legislative measures through. But I think putting it down to the end of the year that doesn't really get you anywhere. Now
you, of course, you talk about the deal that you struck with Tony Blair. How important? I mean, and you'll know the importance of personalities, the relationship between people who are in negotiations. We had this situation where Donald Tusk, the president of the EU Council, has talked of a special place in hell for those who promoted Brexit without even a sketch of a plan of how to carry it out safely. That criticism has gone down very badly in the UK. Was he mistaken to say it?
Well, rather than commenting on one issue, I think in recent weeks, and particularly since the Christmas and the New Year period, the rhetoric on both sides is getting stronger and stronger, and that's never helpful in negotiations. And one of the problems that I think, Sarah, and I've been involved in negotiations of European agreements, but also in the Good Friday Agreement, but also lots of other things with unions and employers. All of this thing in the full gleam of the media makes it very difficult. And it seems to me that with time narrowing down, key people on all sides need to sit down together and to try and knock heads and do it out of the everyday glow, that every time there's a meeting for 50 minutes, there seems to be a 50-minute press conference. And that's a recipe for people making inflammatory statements on both sides, and both in the European Parliament, in the EU Commission, in the Council, the British government, in the Parliament, in Ireland too. So I think it's not the way to conclude negotiations, and I really think there was cool heads.
There was a very interesting moment at a press conference when the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar handed a thank you card to Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission. And it subsequently came out what the text of the thank you card from somebody in Dublin was, saying, thanking Jean-Claude Juncker, for the first time ever, Ireland is stronger than Britain. Would you also thank Jean-Claude Juncker and thank Brussels for strengthening Ireland's hand?
Well, I think they have been extremely helpful to us and extremely loyal to backing the Good Friday Agreement. So obviously I welcome that solidarity that we've had. But I equally don't want to see, like, the interests of the UK and Ireland in all of this are enormous. I have no interest in us going back to the days of the past when we have a critical match and a slagging match, as we'd say in Dublin with each other. That will get none of us anywhere. Like, I think both our economies are too important, the jobs of our people, the trade that we do with each other, the relationship with our agricultural community and to the British consumers for food. All these things are hugely important to the island of Ireland. And, you know, the amount of goods that go every day between north and south, back and forward, sometimes the same items go back and forward a few times for various processes and reasons. So the last thing I want to see, and, you know, 20 years ago I got a lot of credit for improving the relationship between Ireland and the UK, and I do not want to go back to the bad old days where we criticised each other and ridiculed each other. So I think that's why I think the language needs to be stopped and tempered down. We need to be more considerate, and I think the key people need to sit down and try and negotiate a conclusion.
But there are many things that have changed in that time, not least the demographics in Northern Ireland, where there are an increasing number of Catholics. And Northern Ireland, of course, voted to remain in the EU, which is why there are increasing calls for another vote, a vote on the reunification of Ireland. And we have Sinn Féin's Deputy Leader, Michelle O'Neill, saying a new generation is already questioning partition, particularly in the context of Brexit, and calling on the Irish government to prepare a realistic plan for reunification. What do you say to those who say, look, this is maybe what the people of the island of Ireland want?
Well, I certainly don't think this is the time to either talk about it or to have such a poll, the border poll as it's called. It is correct to say, and I was responsible for putting a provision in the Good Friday Agreement, that there can be a border poll from time to time with the say-so of the Secretary of State based on changing circumstances. But the key issue is that we don't have institutions up in Northern Ireland. We don't have the Assembly, the Executive, the North-South bodies, the East-West bodies. And the absence of those for the last few years, I think, has been detrimental to the progress that we would have made in all of these discussions if they had been running. And I think the Irish government or the British government can't be blamed for that. And I think the idea of not getting them up and running and not seeing them working for several years, maybe then you could consider a border poll. But to have a border poll now in the middle of this would be an act of insanity, in my view.
OK, but ultimately, in the next 20 years, perhaps longer, do you think a united Ireland will be inevitable?
I wouldn't say inevitable, but I do think you will see a border poll. And I do think if the UK, which seems, you know, almost positive now, pull out of the EU, the issue then will not just be about whether there should be a united Ireland. People will also be reflecting, do Northern Ireland want to be in the European Union or not? Now, Scotland might have a similar position in years to come, but I do see that being a factor that people who want to be in Europe will say a united Ireland is more attractive. But so, I would really only want to even talk about that discussion when I see the institutions in Northern Ireland working properly for a prolonged period and proving that they are capable of handling issues.
So just briefly, given where we are with the Brexit negotiations, how fearful are you that all you achieved 20 years ago could come unstuck?
I am worried about that, Sarah. I think the difficulty, the slippery slope sometimes is something you can't stop on. And I just fear that if we end up with any kind of a hard border, we would be on a slippery slope. I'd hate to think it, but I worry about it.
Bertie Ahern, thank you very much.